morning, everyone, and welcome to District 13's weekly Zoom. Before we get started, I want to make a commercial about next week's Zoom. Next week's Zoom is going to feature illustrious brother Brent Morris. He is a Masonic scholar of some reputation, and he will be providing us information about the history and origins of the higher degrees of Freemasonry. Craft Masonry is fun; it's where it's at. But there's so much more to craft masonry, and it's nice when you can get Masonic scholar of Brent's caliber to come join us for one of these events. But tonight, I'm really excited for this particular Zoom meeting because the topic that is going to be presented to us today is one of the, actually, if not the most seminal topic in Freemasonry, one of the most seminal topics, at least in Freemasonry, and it deals with what happened in the early days of Freemasonry here in the United States. I don't want to spoil it, so I'm going to leave it to our presenter. It's my privilege to introduce illustrious and very worshipful brother Jeremy Yielding. Jeremy is past master of Steilacoom Lodge number 2, a couple times over, right?
3 times, 3-time loser,
and also past deputy of the Grand Master District 15. Currently, he is the chairman of the Leadership Training Committee with the Grand Lodge. I'm a big fan of Jeremy's, so I'm looking forward to this presentation. Jeremy, you've got screen sharing; it's all yours, and we're looking forward to what you have to offer today.
Brethren, thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you guys can see it. We good?
Got it.
Perfect. Brethren, thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I am a member of the Valley of Tacoma, the Scottish Rite, where I serve as the commander of Kadosh, a body which governs the 19th through the 30th degrees of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. The degrees presented in that body both expand upon and provide additional lenses to view the lessons taught in the Blue Lodge. So our presentation this evening came about as a result of a challenge that I'd laid out for myself while I was master of Steilacoom in 2019. I wanted a year full of value for the members of my lodge, and I set out to provide some of that value through educational programs. My goal is to have a program presented at each meeting. Content, they say, is king, and sometimes my creative it got down near the bottom. And so after finishing a stated communication, I challenged the audience for a topic to present at the next stated, and the Morgan Affair was suggested. I had a limited understanding of the Morgan Affair. I'd been interested in it, as I'd heard that it involved upstate New York, where I had attended college, and knew that it involved an example of a real Masonic conspiracy, where back in 1826, men who were known to be Masons conspired to kidnap a guy and maybe had even murdered him. So I put together the paper and I presented it the next stated communication, and I archived it, or so I thought, on my computer to be pulled out at a later date. Unfortunately, in transitioning to the new PC, the narrative was lost, which I only discovered after I had agreed to present this topic to you all. Rapid scholarship was required, but fortunately, my brothers, the world's at our fingertips with the digitization of information. The conversion of old tomes into bits and bytes is a miracle of our age and allows us to get past the Wikipedia entries and down into the finer supporting detail. It's no longer beyond the means of any brother with an internet connection to explore, compile, and research topics that would be of interest to our lodges. And I'd encourage you to establish your own collection of papers and presentations promoting the interest and engagement of your brethren. Encourage your newer members by helping them research a topic that sparks their imagination, then have them present their findings to their brethren. Because Masonry, my brethren, is at its roots work. So where to begin? Please advance. I had a crisis with my slideshow today. All right, there we are. This is both a crazy story and a cautionary tale, full of political, religious, and Masonic implications. It has deception, intrigue, kidnapping, allegations of murder, abuse of power, cries of justice perverted, and the transformation of ignorant unease into targeted rage. This incident is both an example of how one spark of an event can, if the conditions are right, set off an explosive reaction that shakes the nation, and a cautionary tale of how the actions of a few can taint the reputation and dramatically impact the lives of many. The central figure, William Morgan, is described in different ways depending on who you listen to. The images that I've been showing both reportedly depict Morgan. Either he's pictured as a saint or as an absolute sinner. It's been 194 years since the events took place in 1826, but the hyperbole in the source material still makes the lens of reality pretty fractured. At the core of our story, we still have a man who may or may not have been a Mason, who committed to publishing the great mysteries and the secrets of the fraternity, who was abducted, screaming, from the jail at Canandaigua by men who are known to have been Masons and subsequently never seen again. But to understand the Morgan affair and its fallout, I believe you need to understand the context of where we were as a nation and where Western New York was as a region. So with the conclusion of the War of 1812 and 1815 and the beginning of the Monroe presidency, our new nation is in what they call the era of good feelings. By the early 1820s, the Hamiltonian Federalists as a party were largely extinct, having been a minority since 1798. And the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans had dominated the scene since the turn of the century, despite having adopted some of the Federalist policies like the Tariff of 1816 and the incorporation of the Second Bank of the United States. At this time in our nation's history, there's a sense of unity and national purpose cultivated by President Monroe, which lasted up through the end of his presidency in 1824. Everyone appears to be under the same party umbrella. But the lack of party competition didn't mean that there was a lack of either personal ambition or geographical sectionalism. In the industrial Northeast, the agrarian South, and the frontier West, all with their own interests. There were factions represented under the big tent of the Democratic Republicans. There was also a lack of a unified nominating process. Instead, candidates were nominated by their state legislatures. As a result, when we get to the election of 1824, there are 4 candidates, all from the same party. Henry Clay of Kentucky, who was the Speaker of the House and the past Grand Master of Kentucky in 1820. William Crawford of Georgia, Secretary of the Treasury. John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, who just a year before had served as the Grand Master of Tennessee. Now Jackson, a populist and the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, won the popular vote that year with 41.4%, and ranked first in the Electoral College with 99 electors. Adams came in second with 30.9% of the popular vote and came in second with 84 electors. Crawford, having suffered a stroke the year before and being unable to campaign effectively, came fourth in the popular vote with 11.2%, but came in third in the Electoral College with 41 electors. Clay comes in third in the popular vote with 13%, but fourth in the Electoral College with 37 electors. Now, in order to be elected president, you needed a majority of the Electoral College votes, and no candidate made the mark. This was significant because it invoked the clause set forth in the 12th Amendment, where the House of Representatives would determine the presidency from among the top 3 vote getters. This left Henry Clay out in the cold as the 4th place finisher, which was ironic by the virtue of his being Speaker of the House, where the matter was to be decided. The congressional representatives from each state in the House voted from amongst the top 3 candidates. The Kentucky State's House, Clay's home state, sent a non-binding recommendation to their congressional delegation to support Jackson. However, the delegation intriguingly ends up supporting Adams, and Adams ends up winning the election. So did Clay, who is the Speaker of the House, unduly influence the voting? Well, one might suspect that something was up, as Adams then turns around and appoints Clay as Secretary of State, which was a position that had historically led to a future presidency. Now, Jackson was infuriated at this. After all, he'd won the popular vote and he'd had the most votes at the initial electoral balloting, and would come to call the apparent political horse trading a corrupt bargain, a slogan that he'd use again and again in his presidency for the next presidential election in 1828. Despite their Masonic commonalities as past Grand Masters, Clay and Jackson detested each other. In fact, when Jackson left political office years later, he was asked if there was anything that he regretted not doing, and he replied that there was. He said, "I didn't shoot Henry Clay, and I did not hang John C. Calhoun, who had served as Jackson's vice president during his first term." So much for brotherly love. So by the time that we're in the middle of the 1820s, the era of good feelings was just about over. Things were changing on the national stage. So with that background of the nation's mood in mind, let's move to the local area where the incident takes place, Western New York. While downstate, near New York City, was developing into an economic powerhouse, upstate New York was rural and agrarian. Rolling hills and wooded farmland predominate the region, still in the process of settlement. The Big Tree Treaty with the Seneca Band of Iroquois was signed in 1797. In fact, many of the towns that feature prominently in this incident are newly settled. So Rochester, which is that star right in the middle here, which was then known as Rochesterville, began in 1811 with just 15 residents, but by 1823 had 2,500 residents and was the seat of Genesee County. Canandaigua settled in 1793 and was incorporated in 1815. Small town of Leroy began in 1790. The tiny town of Stafford in 1798 and was incorporated in 1820. And Batavia, where Morgan lived during the incident, was founded in 1802. Even with efforts to improve and connect upstate New York, like with the building of the Erie Canal, which you can see here, this is still very much the frontier. Growth and settlement of the area brought new people and new ideas into the region. I'll also note the location of Fort Niagara, which will feature prominently later on in the story. Among these ideas, they brought their spiritual and cultural concerns with them, all these new people. A spiritual movement, known as the Second Great Awakening, rolled through the area. These were tent revivals that had begun in the hills and valleys of Tennessee and Kentucky, which found fertile ground in western New York. So much so that the area became known as the Burned Over District, named so by prominent revivalist preacher and later anti-Mason Charles Finney, because of the number and fervor of the revival events that had occurred in the area had made it difficult to reignite new revivals years later. The Second Great Awakening emphasized a personal relationship with God, worship without the need for the intercession of the priest, and boosted the growth of certain denominations like the Methodists and the Baptists. Here's a quote from a preacher who attended one of Finney's revival meetings in Rochester. The whole community was stirred. Religion was the topic of conversation in the house, in the shop, in the office, and on the street. The only theater in the city was converted to a livery stable, the only circus into a soap and candle factory. Grog shops were closed. The Sabbath was honored. The sanctuaries were thronged with happy worshipers. A new impulse was given to every philanthropic enterprise. The fountains of benevolence were opened, and the men lived to good. End quote. In the wake of these revivals, the rationalism and deism of the Enlightenment fell from favor, and while the revival energized those who were influenced by it, it may have also sown division amongst those who rejected it, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who we'll mention in a bit. Perhaps not coincidentally, it's interesting to note that several new denominations appear in the area at this time. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, received his first vision or visitation just outside of his family farm in Palmyra in 1820. A Shaker colony is established in Groveland, a small community just 35 miles away from Morgan's home in Batavia, during the year 1826, which was the very year of the Morgan Affair. The Millerites, from whom descend the Adventist denominations, emerged in Low Hampton a few years later, and spiritualism thrives in the area. Western New York was also a place for social reform. Abolition takes hold in Utica at the Oneida Institute, which ran from 1827 through 1843, where black men were just as welcome as white men to attend the school. The suffragette movement's president is present with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who would preside at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848. And calls for prohibition of strong drink could all be found in the region, but so could Masonry. Even in the town of Batavia, which had 1,671 people in 1830, according to the census, and incorporated only in 1802, there was already a lodge. Now this slide that I've got this map showing up here, it's actually got a couple of inaccuracies on it. Wells Lodge 282 is actually located in Rochester, not in Batavia. And so there's that. You do have Olive Branch Lodge, but that is actually Olive Branch Lodge number 39, I believe, not 215. So we'll talk about that in a bit. So there was already a lodge. Batavia Lodge number 433 had been chartered just 13 months prior to Morgan's abduction. Olive Branch was in nearby Leroy. There had been an explosive growth in Masonry in the years leading up to the Morgan affair. According to John Bizak in his incredible book, Island Freemasonry, from 1773 to 1826, New York admitted more than 1,000 Masons each year. There were 27 new lodges chartered in Genesee County alone in the years from 1812 to 1825. And so with this growth come inevitable growing pains. The quality of the work and the maturity, the practices and discipline of those new lodges would have been something difficult for the Grand Lodge, 300 miles away in New York City, to govern or control. The expansion of Masonry had momentum, and there was much Masonic work to do. And if you were a Mason in the 1820s, you were in pretty good company. DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York, was a past Grand Master from 1806 to 1819, and General Grand Master of the General Grand Encampment of the United States, as well as the General Grand High Priest of the General Royal Arch Chapter of the United States. As has been mentioned before, Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, was a past Grand Master from Kentucky, and Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans, past Grand Master from Tennessee. Even the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, was a past Grand Master of Virginia. But it wasn't just Masonry at a national level. As we'll see throughout the affair, Masons were found in law enforcement as sheriffs, in the local judiciary as judges, and as business owners. Even before the Morgan affair, Masonry had its critics. Some religious denominations worried that lodges were serving as a substitute for church. Others were bothered by the ritual and rumors of obligations that Masons were alleged to have taken. And Masons weren't the only ones targeted by those who disliked ritual and religion. There were anti-Catholic sentiments as well. As we pointed out previously, the whole area was in the midst of the Second Great Awakening revivalist movement. Those watchful souls concerned with the degradation of society caused by the consumption of spirits noted that when a lodge formed, the receipts for alcohol generally increased in the area because festive boards are apparently important. And some were concerned about Masonic or other pernicious influences in the government. As an example, I'd cite the conspiracy theories of this guy right here, Jedediah Morse, who is not only the father of American geography, but also the father of Samuel Morse, who is the inventor of the telegraph, of course. Now, Jedediah was afraid that the Illuminati might have infiltrated the government to the end that our federal republic might be destroyed in a violent uprising like had been seen in the excesses of the French Revolution. The elder Morse confronted none other than President Washington at the close of the previous century regarding Morse's conspiracy theory, and Washington responds with the following. He says, "It's not my intention to doubt that the doctrine of the Illuminati and the principles of Jacobinism had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more satisfied of this fact than I am. The idea that I meant to convey was that I did not believe the lodges of Freemasons in this country had, as societies, endeavored to propagate the diabolical tenets of the first or pernicious principles of the latter, if they're susceptible of separation." So Morse then goes on to accuse in a sermon that he had evidence of an Illuminati group in Virginia, but it was later found out that it was simply a regular lodge of Freemasons. So brethren, you have the context, the stage is set. National politics was in a time of transition with one party disappearing and another splintering. There's a generational shift happening, having lost or losing our founding fathers. Both Presidents Adams and Jefferson pass away on the same day, July 4th of 1826. Western New York was experiencing its first decades of settlement. Religious revivals led to the birth of spiritual movements and a critical examination of the behavior of themselves and their neighbors. Social movements decried the evils of drink, of slavery, and the need to establish the rights of women to vote. The Masonic fraternity was expanding dramatically, following right along with the expansion and establishment of the towns and villages as New York State sought to solidify its commercial and governmental infrastructure. All that was left was to drop a final set of ingredients into the simmering pot to bring it to a rolling boil. And the main ingredient, of course, is the unlikely figure of William Morgan. Now, we know that he was born in Culpeper, Virginia in about 1774. He began working as an operative stonemason, and then later as a brick mason. We believe him to have been a veteran of the War of 1812, and in some stories, it's alleged that he'd actually sailed with the notorious pirate Jean Lafitte's men. Thus, he's sometimes given the honorific of captain. There are also several William Morgans listed in the rolls of the Virginia militia, but none of those with the rank of captain. He married the daughter of a Methodist minister, Lucinda Pendleton, in Richmond, Virginia in 1819, he being about 25 years her senior. We also know that he lived and worked for a time in Little York, Ontario, which is now Toronto, where he unsuccessfully tried operating his hand as a brewer, but he was soon bankrupt and his brewery burned. With his creditors in pursuit, remember that this was a time when he could be jailed for debt, he fled and found employment in Rochester, New York as an operative stonemason. Having secured employment, he sent for his wife, who had been living with kindly and charitable neighbors. They then moved down to Batavia in about 1823, where they had 2 children, one in 1824 and one in 1826. Lucinda and the kids were rooming separately with a family named Stewart, while Morgan lived in the home of John Davids, another man who would prove to be central to our story. So let's talk a bit about the character of Morgan. It's a retrospective character that depends on who you ask and what sources you read. From those who sought to demonize their fraternity, he was a gentle family man who, although he may have loved a genial toast, was a credit to his community and was foully dealt with because he tried to expose the alleged corruption at the core of the craft. But if you ask those on the other side of the affair, they describe him with terms like sot, a bummer, a wretch, and a hanger-on at grog shops, who had abandoned wife and children to the charity of the public, who was said to have been violent when he was drunk, swinging his frail wife around by her hair and breaking up the furniture. But he's also said to have been able to hold court in a tavern as the chief among equals, telling tales of his service and exploits during the war. So what's the truth of his character? Well, it may lie somewhere in the middle. In Bentley's book, The History of the Abduction of William Morgan and the Anti-Masonic Excitement of 1826 to 30, the author states that it was, quote, well authenticated that Morgan was intemperate to a very moderate degree and possessed of but few moral principles or attributes, perhaps of honor or honesty. He had only a very limited education, but those who were personally acquainted with him at Rochester and Batavia concur that he was pleasant in his manners when he was sober, and conducting towards his family and friends in those seasons like other men of similar habits. He had a wondrous faculty of getting into debt, but none to get out. He was considered among his acquaintances what would at this day, and that was in 1874, probably be called a deadbeat. So was he a Mason? Well, Morgan claimed that he'd received his degrees in Canada, but no proof had ever been found to substantiate his initiation, passing, or raising. The lack of documentation is not absolute definitive proof of his not being a Mason. Things happen. Records are lost through neglect, errors in record keeping, destructive fires. The dog may have eaten his dues card. But whatever the circumstances, it seems that he was vouched for by a friend. Sources say his employer in Rochester was who he had convinced, and he was admitted to Wells Lodge number 282. Once he was vouched for, he began to take part in the local Masonic scene. According again to Bentley, after moving to Batavia, Morgan encountered Blanchard Powers, the Grand Lecturer, and convinced him to give him a course of instruction, perhaps under false pretenses. This instruction allowed him to pass himself off as a Mason without difficulty. Powers, for his part, always denied it, stating that he'd never had any confidence in Morgan or his claims. But that's what's alleged to have happened, according to Bentley. And maybe this makes sense, given the rapid development of Masonry in the region. Perhaps this was how the Grand Lodge was trying to gain some Masonic uniformity and control over the rapidly expanding craft. I wouldn't think it unusual for Brother Powers to offer instruction to a group of Masons in an attempt to establish a level of uniformity and competency in the area. And perhaps Morgan was just naturally talented at picking up the work. Whatever the case, Morgan's vocation as a journeyman bricklayer allowed him to travel throughout the region. When he was new in town, he would happily take part in whatever work was being done. His floor work as senior deacon was praised, and he was commended for his singing voice while at festive boards. He learned the middle chamber lecture and delivered it with gusto and skill, so much that brothers would pay for his lodging and even lend him money. However, he usually only visited the lodge once, as he had a habit of borrowing small items like a pocket knife, a handkerchief, or an overcoat, and then not returning them. While he had a reputation for his performance in the lodge, his reputation for taking care of his family suffered, as any charity dispense had to be given directly to his wife, as Morgan was a hard drinker and a gambler and could not be trusted with it. So we can find no direct evidence that Morgan was ever raised or that he was a member of any lodge, but we do have documentation that he received the Royal Arch degree and swore that he'd regularly received all of the prerequisite degrees. He received the degree at Western Star Chapter of Royal Arch Masons number 35 at Leroy, New York on May 31st, 1825. It's interesting to note that the scribe for that chapter goes on after the incident to blot out all instances of Morgan's name with the inky finger of scorn in the years later. Morgan, for his part, never visited the chapter after his initiation. So, what led up to it? Well, by 1826, William Morgan had become acquainted with David C. Miller, publisher of the Batavia Advocate. Miller claimed that he'd been initiated as an entered apprentice 20 years before in Albany, but had not advanced. In fact, one Masonic author later stated that if Miller had taken one step into the door of Masonry, Morgan had climbed over the wall. Together with Morgan's landlord, John Davids, the three of them entered into a pact to publish an expose on Masonry, and they soon brought a Russell Dyer of Rochester into the mix to help them secure the capital necessary for the publishing of the book. This had the promise of great commercial success, and Morgan was to get a quarter of the profits. Morgan, wanting to keep the whole thing under wraps while the book was in development, forced his partners to sign a promise that they would not reveal the venture. That contract was signed on March 13th of that year. The Masons of Batavia wanted to start a chapter of Royal Arch Masons of their own. As the petition was passed around, Morgan, who was still enthusiastically performing Masonic work in the region and had been regularly initiated as a Royal Arch Mason, signed it as well. When it was discovered that the petition had been presented to Morgan and he'd signed it, a new petition was generated. And without Morgan's knowledge, as he was allegedly intoxicated at the time, it was submitted. And when the charter was granted and Morgan found that he was not a member and he was unable to be admitted to the chapter and was therefore excluded, it led Morgan to redouble his efforts on the expose, and he began boasting about his efforts while intoxicated. In fact, in early July of 1826, he brags vociferously about it to David Danold, the owner and proprietor of Danold's Tavern in Batavia. Now, Danold was a master mason, so much for the vow of secrecy exacted from the partners in March. In August, Morgan's partner David Miller begins advertising the upcoming expose through his newspaper, the Republican Advocate, stating that Morgan had written out a full and complete illustration of the esoteric work, the lectures, and all the secret ritual. He promises that it will, in a short time, be issued from his press for the mere price of $1. On August 9th, a notice appeared in the Canandaigua, Ontario Messenger, warning the population about Morgan, who they alleged was a swindler. It read as follows: Notice and caution, if any man calling himself William Morgan should intrude himself on the community, they should be on their guard, particularly the Masonic fraternity. Morgan was in this village in May last, and his conduct while here and elsewhere calls forth this notice. Any information in relation to Morgan can be obtained by calling at the Masonic Hall in this village. W. Morgan is considered a swindler and a dangerous man. There are people in this village who would be happy to see this Captain Morgan. Canandaigua, August 9th, 1826. But Morgan's under other pressure as well. In early July, Morgan's arrested for debts owed in Rochester, and then again on July 25th when Morgan's arrested for a debt owed to a Nathan Follett. His publisher and partner, Miller, bails him out for the July 25th debt. And then on August 7th, a fracture is seen amongst the four conspirators as a letter penned by Morgan states, quote, Gentlemen, my note of this morning has not been answered. Further evasion and equivocation I will not submit to. Acknowledge you are not gentlemen, or I will expose you in 12 hours unless you do as you have agreed to do. I'm not a child. If you suppose I am, you are mistaken. I am a man, and will not suffer myself to be imposed upon. You have not acted as gentlemen. I am sorry to be compelled to say it. Every part of your conduct has been mysterious, and why so? My first impressions were that you were not honest men. Therefore I wish to settle and have no more to do with you. If either of you feel hurt, call on me as gentlemen, and I will give you any satisfaction you wish. Signed, William Morgan. Dyer and Davids, and later David Johns, either being cowed by the threats of violence or wanting to keep the book on track, execute a penal bond to Morgan for $500,000, conditioned for the payment of the 1/4 share of the proceeds of the book, meaning that unless Morgan received his money from the sale of the book, the other 3 partners would need to make good on the bond. On August 19th, Thomas Macoy sues Morgan, and he remained in jail until Miller and others bailed him out. At this point, Morgan must have seen the liability in getting his book completed. Things are not going well for Morgan and his partners. And on September 7th, the Black Rock Gazette from Buffalo had the following letter to the editor. Mr. Salisbury, sir, I noticed in your last paper an inadvertent error, copied perhaps from other prints, respecting a wretch of the name of Morgan. The statement that the man is an expelled Mason is a mistake. He is not an expelled Mason, but an impostor and a swindler against the evil designs of whom the fraternity has amply provided. By this point, things should have stopped. Things could have stopped. There was an excellent letter written by the respected local Mason Henry Brown that was published in the local newspaper, Spirit of the Times, and that's actually a copy of the front page of this issue. It's on page 2, sort of tucked in against the fold. But he publishes this on September 1st, 1826, 10 days before Morgan's disappearance, urging the Masons of the area to restrain their inflamed passions. I'll just quote a little bit of it here, as the letter is really lengthy. Quote, the indiscreet conduct of some Masons, the unheard of asperity of the enemies of Masonry, and the matter contained in our village papers the past 2 weeks, induced me to attempt to rescue the order from the destruction which awaits it, and the character of our village from indelible disgrace. Some time ago, a pretended member of the fraternity announced in bar rooms and elsewhere his intention to publish the secrets of Masonry. This was not because he'd been injured, but in order to repair a broken fortune and, if possible, barter his fidelity and his oath for money. Some of the Masons have taken alarm, but why or wherefore no one can satisfactorily tell. Nothing could be more indiscreet or useless. The lion may as well be alarmed because an army of crows has threatened to invade his proud domain. The attempt has often been made before, but always proved abortive. No man in his sober senses can credit the perjured wretch who commences his career by the publication of his infamy. And all such efforts of debased men have terminated in disgrace. The man who would discharge a handful of mud against the sun at meridian height with a view to arrest its course or extinguish its beams would act as rationally as he who would publish the secrets of our order in expectation of injuring our cause. In the one case, he might for perhaps a moment pollute the atmosphere within his limited circle and probably draw down upon his guilty head a filthy and corrupted shower. In the other, he would violate his oath, sacrifice his duty to his friends and to his God, and at last, to crown the scene, receive the reward which a depraved world never fails to bestow on acknowledged guilt, and Freemasonry would still survive. End quote. But to understand the passions that play here is important. Quoting from Morris, Robert Morris, the sight of Morgan, whose family had for years enjoyed their beneficence, that besotted and ungrateful wretch, proclaiming publicly in the streets from day to day that, quote, he was half through the first degree, that he would finish the entered apprentice degree next week, and that he had copyrighted his book and would shortly have it ready, that for $1 he would give the people more masonry than that damned lodge ever knew. The scene presented by the wretch, repeating to the crowd in a public bar room what he called the obligation of masonry. The aggravations increasing each day of the lewd classes of the villages, publicly throwing out signs and gestures which Morgan had taught them. So, brethren, passions, despite eloquent, wise counsel and admonishment from others that the matter of Morgan and his book should be ignored, were running high. On September the 8th, a mob of 40 to 50 disguised men assembled at the office of the print shop, ransacked the shop looking for the manuscript, and set the shop aflame, but the fire is quickly extinguished. The lodge and chapter at Batavia condemned the break-in and the arson attempt and offer a $100 reward for the apprehension of the men who took part in the attack. The worshipful master of Batavia 433 is a signatory. He's the first signatory to the handbills, promising the reward. No one is ever caught. So let's talk about the undisputed facts of the incident. On September 10th, information was filed with the Justice of Peace of Canandaigua over a shirt and cravat that Morgan had borrowed and not returned to an innkeeper, Mr. Kingley. A warrant for Morgan's arrest was drawn up. The warrant was given to Nicholas Chesborough, coroner of the county, but he gave it to Constable Holiday Hayward. Constable Hayward traveled to Batavia, about a 50-mile journey, arrested Morgan, and brought him to Canandaigua by September 11th. The justice decided that the borrowing of the shirt and cravat was not larceny and released Morgan. However, Morgan was indebted to an innkeeper and he was arrested for that debt, rendered to Sheriff Israel Hall, and brought to the jail at about 11 o'clock at night. In the evening of the 12th, Brother Lawton Lawson calls on Morgan at the jail. Sheriff Hall was out, but Mrs. Hall arranged for Lawson to talk to Morgan. Mrs. Hall later said she testified that she overheard Lawson ask Morgan if he'd go home with him if he paid the fine, and Morgan said he would. Lawson then offered to pay Morgan's debt, but Mrs. Hall refuses as she doesn't want to make that decision in the absence of her husband. Brother Nicholas Chesborough and Brother Ed Sawyer, businessmen in Canandaigua, also arrive at the jail, reassure Mrs. Hall that it'd be all right to release Morgan with the payment of the debt. So at about 9 o'clock at night, on a moonlit September night, Morgan is released with brothers Lawson, Chesborough, and Sawyer. As she walks the prison door, she hears a cry of murder once or twice and saw Morgan struggling between two men. She then sees a carriage pass by headed east and then headed west. The cries of murder are substantiated by a Dr. Hall, who is a respected physician who was in the area of the jail at the time. The hired carriage driver, who denied that Morgan was physically abducted into the carriage, takes them a bit out of town where they pick up worshipful brother John Whitney. Whitney rides up with the driver to the town of Victor, where they stop to water the horses, and the passengers get out to have a drink at the inn. They also stop at the towns of Mendon and Pittsford to water the horses, but the passengers stay inside. They arrive at Rochester at daybreak on September the 13th, and the carriage stops a few miles on the other side of Rochester at a place called Hanford's Landing, where they change carriages and drivers. They then take the Ridge Road at about sundown, having changed horses at regular intervals along the way. They arrive at Rite's Tavern, 3 miles north of Lockport, where they are met by Sheriff Eli Bruce, the sheriff of Niagara County, also a Mason, and a group of about 50 Masons. From this point forward, Sheriff Bruce seems to have charge of the party. At 9 o'clock, they arrive at Molyneux's Tavern near Lewiston, where the second carriage driver discharges his passengers into another carriage, and the party proceeds to Youngstown and to Colonel King's house, about 6 miles out of Lewiston, where they proceeded to about half a mile from Fort Niagara, where they left the carriage and proceeded on foot to the fort. There they met with Brother Edward Giddings, keeper of the lighthouse, and proceeded to cross the river in a ferry boat up to the Canadian side, but not finding the folks that they expected to find there, they returned to Fort Niagara, and Morgan is confined to the magazine. And here is where the confirmed trail stops. And this is the very famous map of the ride from, as Morgan is taken from Batavia to Canandaigua, and then the evening escape occurs, and they're taken all the way through Rochester next day, and then out to eventually Fort Niagara. And then they come for Miller, but actually they come for both Miller and Davids. This is the next day. Miller is arrested on September 12th as there's a warrant sworn out for the debt of $40 by a man named Daniel Johns, who had paid to secure an interest in the upcoming book against both the publisher Miller and John Davids, Morgan's landlord. The warrant is signed off by Justice Barton Leroy, and Constable French is to serve it. So after the attack on September 8th, and there were allegations that the attack was staged by virtue of there being water barrels conveniently and oddly placed near the shop, Miller had taken pains to fortify his print shop. So the constable and his posse armed themselves for the arrest of Davids and Miller, while Miller's friends armed themselves with clubs. And both sides fortify themselves with strong drink in preparation for the confrontation. And so for about 15 minutes, there is the potential for great violence in the streets of Batavia as a standoff ensues. Constable French and his assistant Wilcox have his forces stand where they are as the two of them advance alone into the printer's office and capture Miller and Davids. To the great amusement of the gathered posse, who were a little inflamed by drink, they all then repair to Dan Old's tavern, because tavern. Davids, however, is released because he's already under jail bond for debt and can't leave Batavia. Miller is placed into a carriage and, on the way to Leroy, stop off at the lodge in the small village of Stafford, where they take him into the lodge room and interrogate Miller in an attempt to get the manuscript. Miller's friends arrive at the scene and force the procession to continue to Leroy. Discretion is heeded, and the parties make it to Leroy, where, due to the absence of the plaintiff in the matter, Miller gets acquitted. Now, the fallout from this sees Constable French, his assistant Wilcox, and posse member James Hurlburt, as well as James Ganson, the tavern keeper of Stafford, eventually indicted and tried in April of 1827 for an alleged riot, assault and battery, and the false imprisonment of David Miller. French receives 12 months, Wilcox 6 months, and Hurlburt 3-month sentences. Ganson was acquitted. But the question on everyone's mind is, where is Morgan? Since he'd last been seen at Fort Niagara, a popular theory was that he'd been murdered and dumped in the lake. In order to find out what happened, meetings were called in Batavia on September 25th and again on October 4th. People were genuinely concerned that someone could be spirited away extrajudicially, as many of those involved in law enforcement, in business, and in the court system were connected to the fraternity. Morgan had disappeared. So what was to stop any of them from disappearing in like manner? So affidavits were sworn out, and the trial scheduled in November of 1826 for brothers Chesborough, Lawson, and Sawyer. Although they initially entered the plea of not guilty, when the trial opened, they pled guilty. Evidence was entered by Mrs. Hall, the jailer's wife, the jailer Mr. Hall, 2 of the carriage drivers, and others. Nicholas Chesborough receives a year in prison. Lawton Lawson got 2 years, while Edward Sawyer got a month. In announcing the sentences, the judge excoriates the lot of them for their extrajudicial rendition of Morgan as a threat to the existence of the Republic, and gave the world a taste of the anti-Masonic fury that was to come. All told, more than 4 years are spent in trials in Canandaigua, sorting out the aftermath of all of those alleged, I think there was like 34 of them, to have been involved in Morgan's alleged abduction. Sheriff Eli Bruce was removed as sheriff by Governor Clinton and received 2 years and 4 months in prison. Colonel King died prior to trial. There is no murder charges ever filed against any of them, as no corpse could be found. Or was it? And we'll get to that in a moment. But Governor Clinton, for his part, issued 3 separate proclamations, October 4th, October 26th, and March 19th of 1827, setting forth an escalating series of rewards. Quote, that if living, Morgan might be returned to his family. If murdered, that the perpetrators might be brought to punishment. Masonic bodies everywhere were proclaiming their innocence in the affair and condemning the actions of any who might have been involved. As an example, the Grand Royal Arch Chapter of New York unanimously passed this resolution at their annual convocation in February of 1827. Resolved by this Grand Chapter that we, its members, individually and as a body, do disclaim all knowledge or approbation of proceedings in relation to the abduction of William Morgan, and that we disapprove of the same as a violation of the majesty of the laws and an infringement on the rights of personal liberty secured to every citizen of our free and happy republic. Similar resolutions were passed in most of the subordinate chapters of the state, and also by many of the Blue Lodges. On February of 1827, a convention assembled at Leroy where 40 Masons, and some say it was only 10 or 12, and some of those had already been expelled from the fraternity, but they were alleged to have said that Freemasonry was wicked, had murdered Morgan, and renounced the craft. By March of 1827, the anti-Masonic committees that had been organizing at the county level met at Lewiston, which is up near Fort Niagara, and vowed to drive Masonry from the land. It's from these 2 events, the convention at Leroy and the convention in March at Lewiston, that sparked the flame that would be kindled and tended by folks such as Thurlow Weed and Solomon Southwick into the Anti-Masonic Party. There would be a total of 19 anti-Masonic conventions held in the state of New York that year alone. The convention of Baptist churches at Milton and Saratoga County in March was probably the first organized religious opposition. But Masons were soon put on trial in their churches just for being Masons. You could be removed from the congregation for your Masonic affiliation. The Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Congregationalists all readily took up with anti-Masonic fervor, and it's easy to see why. In short order, a number of newspapers, mostly two-sheet, four-page affairs, appear espousing anti-Masonic principles. 53 of them in Pennsylvania, 46 in New York, 4 in Vermont, and 9 in Ohio. Among the editors were Weed at his newly renamed Anti-Masonic Inquirer in Rochester, and Southwick at the helm of the National Observer in Albany. There are virulent and scurrilous charges laden in these papers, and here's a doozy from the Southwick Observer. Anti-Masonry sprung from the throne of God, and under his almighty wings it will conquer hell's masterpiece and redeem our country from vile slavery and galling chains, from eternal disgrace, from everlasting ruin and degradation. The man who hesitates to support such a cause stabs his country and dishonors his Creator. Let no such man be trusted. Let him live neglected and die unpitied and despised. And let no monument tell his name or point to the spot where his recreant ashes pollute the soil that give him birth. So in the middle of all of this tumult, it's finally found in October of 1827, 13 months after the disappearance of Morgan. On October 7th, a corpse is found in Oak Orchard Harbor, about 40 miles from Fort Niagara. The discoverer summoned the coroner and 24 other citizens to act as a witness to the performance of his duty. They pulled a shutter from a nearby barn, fetching the body out of the low tide and carrying it up the bank. The body was not in good condition, and reportedly those nearby, including the coroner, soon lost the contents of their stomachs to the sight and the odor. Still, the autopsy proceeded. Length of the corpse, 5 feet 10 inches. No scars noticeable in the condition of the flesh. Man about 46 years of age. Remains of heavy whiskers and thick hair over the head. Teeth sound and nothing remarkable about them. The 2 potters who first discovered the body and were well acquainted with William Morgan testify that this corpse has no resemblance by which they should recognize Morgan. Clothing, etc., fully described. In one of the pockets, a package of religious tracts. Verdict: found drowned. Clothes, etc., carefully dried and placed in the hands of the magistrate at Carleton, 6 miles distant. Coffin procured, and body decently shrouded and interred. So Thurlow Weed saw the coroner's notice. He put together a party of men, including Morgan's old partners, Russell Dyer and David Miller, and they met at the grave on October 13th. They disinter the body, take it to Carleton, and have it examined. Mrs. Morgan was sent for, and a second inquest was held the following Monday. The body was now black, bloated, putrid, and offensive beyond anything conceivable. The head was now nearly bald, but only had a few tufts of hair that could be seen. The whiskers had disappeared, but curiously, the ears and nostrils now sported long white hairs. Mrs. Morgan looks at the body briefly and identifies the body as that of her husband, William. The body is taken to Batavia and buried on October 19th. On returning from the inquest, Weed has an exchange with a rival newspaper editor, a man by the name of O'Reilly, who asked him, "Well, Weed, have you manufactured the body of Morgan's?" Weed replied, "I guess you will find it a good enough Morgan till after the election." Meanwhile, in Canada, Timothy Monroe had been missing since September 24th, having departed Newcastle for Fort George on the American shore, but on returning the boat tipped over and he was drowned. A search had been made, but the body not recovered. Mrs. Monroe goes to Carleton, where the clothes were kept, and is able to describe without seeing them how the stocking and clothes had been mended, how one of the leg of the pants was longer than the other, how the pockets were lined, and just the minutest marks upon them. A third jury is impaneled in Batavia on October 29th, and the corpse again exhumed. Those that testified included those that saw the body when it first came out of the water. They testified to the hair on its head and the whiskers on its face. The corpse was again measured at 5 foot 9 inches, and if properly stretched out, they figured it'd be 5 foot 11 inches. The state of decomposition was also noted not to be so advanced as to be more than 2 months dead. The differences were obvious. The corpse was taller than Morgan by 3 to 4 inches, had a full head of hair while Morgan was bald, and had only been dead for a couple of months while Morgan disappeared more than a year ago. The body was definitively determined to be that of Timothy Monroe and subsequently brought back to Canada and interred. So if desecrating a corpse wasn't bad enough, and this is Thurlow Weed here, Weed made an allegation very late in life in 1882 that he'd extracted a confession from worship brother John Whitney, master of the lodge in Rochester, and who also served time for his participation in the Morgan abduction. Weed said that the reason for the confession had not come to light so far was because Whitney had died in 1860 and so had been unable to sign it. The confession alleged that the conspiracy had lured Morgan into a boat with the promise of being taken to Canada to start a new life when they entangled him with ropes and pushed him overboard. Fortunately for Weed, Whitney lived until 1869. Whitney did speak to Weed at 1860 at a conference in Tremont House in Boston. The conversation, according to Whitney's son, was much more confrontational than confessional. Quote, Whitney accosted Weed with the query, "What are you lying about me so for? What are all these damn stories you're telling about me and Morgan?" Weed endeavored to pacify him, begged him not to be angry, and assured him that he was only using the statements for political effect, but Whitney insisted that they should be dropped. Nor would he desist until Weed had promised to say no more about the matter. Whitney said, "If you don't stop it, I'll wring your damn nose off." And his manner was so threatening that for a moment he seemed really about to pull Weed's nose. Instead, Whitney goes on to give an account to Robert Morris. You're already familiar with most of the facts of the journey from Canandaigua up to Fort Niagara, but it does add some insight to the story. So Whitney was master of a lodge in Rochester and was concerned with the upcoming expose. He was able to consult with Governor Clinton, who strictly forbade anything illegal, but recommended that they try and purchase the manuscript from Morgan. Clinton backs the purchase for up to $1,000 so that Morgan's enticed to give up the manuscript and escape from his partners. The last week of August finds Whitney interviewing Morgan in Danold's Tavern. Morgan admitted to Whitney that he'd never been initiated into Masonry, but that he was afraid of being subject to bodily harm from Davids and his partners if he failed to deliver the manuscript. Now remember that Davids was also in a destitute condition, having been jail bonded for debt during the episode of September 12th, and very much looked forward to the proceeds from the book. Whitney offers Morgan $50 if he'd agree to be arrested on a minor charge, taken 50 miles away to Canandaigua, and then escorted to Canada to a farm where his family would be restored to him. Morgan assents to the plan, is given $50, and Whitney even takes a receipt. So when the constable comes for Morgan on the appointed day, Morgan goes peaceably. They arrive at Canandaigua, he's processed for the shirt and cravat offense, released, and then rearrested for the tavern debt. During the night in jail, he's furnished with food and drink, and unfortunately for all involved, the drink is liquor of some kind, allegedly. When he's released the following day, he's argumentative, and thus the screams of "murder, help, murder." So Whitney arrives, and Morgan calms down, and he gets into carriage according with plan. They make a trek in the carriages, as noted before. Morgan isn't restrained at all during the journey, but he does keep his silk handkerchief over his eyes as he suffered from eye pain, which was well known. They stop at several taverns along the way for refreshment. When they make it to Fort Niagara and cross the river with lighthouse keeper Giddens, they are met by a couple of brothers who state that the Canadian Freemasons aren't ready for Morgan yet, and they return to the American side where Morgan's held for 5 days. On September 18th, Morgan's confronted in the magazine by several Masons. Morgan recounts his confession that he'd given at Danold's Tavern back in August. And this image here, by the way, is from Leo Taxel's publication and the later hoax, just FYI. So there's that. And then Morgan is given 2 options. He can have a farm at Breeds Hill in Canada and have his family sent to him, or he can have a horse and $500 in gold. Morgan opts for the horse and the gold, and he's given explicit instructions not to return to the U.S. without express permission. Several Masons accompany Morgan to the other side of the river, where Morgan's given the horse and the gold. Morgan's offered an escort, but he declines. Sheriff Bruce, Horse Brother Whitney, and Colonel King hired trackers to find Morgan. They reported that Morgan traveled to York, again Toronto, then to Richmond Hill, and then to Point Hope, where he sells the horse, and he gets on a steamer bound for Boston. And that's where the trail ends. So Morgan's illustration of Masonry does get published, and because of the anti-Masonic excitement, it's commercially successful. It goes through an edition at Batavia and then subsequent editions and reprints at Rochester. The manuscript itself turns out to be a reprint of a previously released expose, notably Jachin and Boaz, which was reprinted in the U.S. in 1812 with some commentary by Morgan. But even without the printing of the text, the damage was done. The anti-Masonic excitement spun up so fiercely in western New York and spread to Pennsylvania, Vermont, and several other states. Here are some resolutions passed from the anti-Masonic conventions. Resolved, that we will not support any person for any office, either in town, county, or state, or hear any preacher of the gospel who is a member of the Masonic fraternity from Elbow, New York, in March 3rd of 1827. Resolved, that we deem Freemasons as such unfit for any office of trust or confidence in town, county, or state, from Covington, New York, March 10th of 1827. And some men renounced their affiliation with the craft. Others were pariahs in their community. They're cast out of their congregations. Some chose to seek a new life away from their intolerant neighbors and head west. Being an anti-Mason becomes a tagline found in the everyday advertisements of merchants and shopkeepers in the anti-Masonic papers. For example, John Smith, fervent anti-Mason, has dry goods and salt shipments in, that sort of stuff. Batavia Lodge number 433 ends up being looted on St. John's Day. The jewels of that lodge can now be found at the Museum of the Grand Lodge of Michigan, carried there by a Mason seeking to escape the conflict by fleeing to what was at that time the frontier. The havoc caused by the Morgan affair can be pretty clearly tracked by the plummeting numbers of lodges operating under the Grand Lodge of New York and Vermont. In New York, we went from 227 active lodges in 1825 to 49 active lodges in 1835. In Vermont, all lodges closed and became dormant, and the Grand Lodge ceased to hold sessions for several years. The Grand Line, if I understand it correctly, had to stay in place for 10 years. Right, worshipful brother Ed, you better hope this COVID thing clears up. Maine's Grand Lodge failed to meet for several years. From 1834 to 1843, their annual communication met once with no constituent lodges, and only had representatives from more than 4 lodges twice. Impacts were felt across the region: in Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and several other states. But that isn't to say that Masonry goes away. There are some stalwarts. Olive Branch Lodge number 39 persisted and is regarded as the parent and preserver of Masonry in Western New York. 7 of the most zealous and stalwart members entered into a solemn agreement to meet once every 4 weeks for the purpose of opening the lodge and keeping up the work. Ark Lodge number 33 in Geneva in Ontario County also had 7 members who never surrendered. They'd take back roads and by lanes to get to lodge. Then one by one in the dark of night by the back door and at long dispersed intervals, they would enter the lodge. So one of the fascinating things about the anti-Masonic movement is the way that in some ways it becomes a bridge between the era of good feelings with the Democratic Republicans and the emergence of the Jacksonian Democrats, the anti-Jacksonians, the anti-Masons, and what will become the Whig Party. So we have here John Quincy Adams, Millard Fillmore, Seward, and of course Thurlow Weed. So it wasn't long before the anti-Masonic movement was harnessed for political gain, with the resolutions coming out of the conventions decrying that no Mason should be in any office anywhere. It was a short hop to formulate a slate of candidates to replace those Masonic scoundrels. Jackson, an unabashed Mason, was their ultimate target. In fact, the anti-Masons tried to convince past Grand Master Henry Clay of Kentucky to renounce the fraternity in 1827, and run as the Anti-Masonic presidential candidate. Most worshipful Brother Clay refused. Still, they were a formidable group and include folks like William Seward, Millard Fillmore, and even the old Federalist turned Democratic Republican turned anti-Mason, John Quincy Adams. In 1828, the Congress was divided between the Jacksonian Democrats and the anti-Jacksonians. The Anti-Masonic Party runs several candidates for the House and manages to win 5 seats, their first on the national stage. The Jacksonian Democrats are the clear winner with 136 representatives, gaining 23 from the 1826 contest, and the anti-Jacksonians have 72, which was a loss of 28 seats from the previous election. In 1830, the anti-Masons pick up 12 more seats for a total of 17. Jackson still had a clear majority with 126, the anti-Jacksonians had 66, and the states' rights-oriented group called the Nullifiers had 4. 1832 marks the zenith of the Anti-Masonic Party. They run a presidential candidate, William Wirt. Now, Wirt's an interesting guy for a lot of reasons. He's a great attorney general and was picked by Jefferson as a future colossus in American politics. But he never quite gets there. In fact, he is a Mason. He wins the nomination at a presidential nominating convention in Boston's Faneuil Hall in 1830, the first nominating convention held by a national political party. Wirt goes on at his acceptance speech to tell the crowd that he found Freemasonry unobjectionable, and that in his experience, many Masons were intelligent men of high and honorable character who would never choose Freemasonry above their duties to God and country. He ends up taking 6.8% of the popular vote and wins the state of Vermont. They also, in that election, pick up 8 more representatives. They now have a total of 25 in the Congress. In 1831, William Palmer is elected governor of Vermont. He's responsible for the passage of a bill that outlawed extrajudicial oaths. He also tried to pass a bill that would have dissolved the Grand Lodge of Vermont. In 1835, Joseph Rittner is elected governor of Pennsylvania. Now, for the convention of 1835, to decide who's going to run on the national ticket in 1836, the party inquires as to the suitability of William Henry Harrison. But they can't get Harrison to tell them whether or not he's a Mason. So they're left without a candidate, and they end up resolving to take the matter up in 1837 and discuss the future of their party. So nobody ran that year. So they meet in 1837, but by that time, most anti-Masons had adopted the Whig Party as the leading alternative to the Jacksonian Democrats. In their final nominating convention of 1838, they did go on to nominate Harrison as their candidate for president, with Daniel Webster as the vice presidential choice. The Whigs, however, go on to also nominate Harrison, and the party is largely absorbed into the Whigs by 1840. But the tactics of the anti-Masons, the direct appeal to the popular vote, the communication via mass media, the newspapers, having big rallies and conventions, that gets folded into the Whig bag of tricks in their party politics moving forward. And just when we think we've seen the last of the anti-Masons, they're resurrected by the National Christian Association in 1868 by abolitionist John Blanchard. And really they come alive in 1872 when they reorganize the party. The movement lasts for about 10 years and espouses Christianity, temperance, and the abolition of secret societies, and the abolition of the Electoral College. They also raise funds to place this large column and statue of an idealized Morgan in the Batavia Cemetery, ironically at the very spot where we'd have the body of the good enough Morgan buried 55 years before. It's important to remember that there was real damage done and the dangers here. Real harm was done and lives were literally ruined. Brother Eli Bruce was in his 30s when he was sheriff of Niagara County, and he's in prison for 28 months. After his release, he takes up the practice of medicine in his hometown of Lewiston, but succumbs to cholera after only a year, dying at the age of 39. Brother Nicholas Chesborough was a haberdasher, hat maker, and a coroner at the same time, and he serves his time quietly. But he lives the rest of his life quietly as well, eventually working in the Postal Service. I was able to find an image of his tombstone on Find a Grave. Does anyone notice what's missing? There's no Masonic emblem on this grave. Family choice, his choice, I'm not sure, but it's not there. Even today, at the Grand Lodge in New York website, some 200 years later, there is no lodge in Batavia. There's Olive Branch Lodge number 39 still hanging out in Leroy. Oh, and of course, let's go back one. William Morgan. What happened to Morgan? There are all kinds of fancy theories, and we can go into this after a little while if you guys would like, but there are all kinds of different crazy theories about what happened to Morgan. Probably the most likely, of course, is that with $500 of gold in his pocket and a penchant for strong intoxicants, something bad may have happened to him in his time in Canada. But we will never know. But what can we learn? Well, I hope this presentation has recommitted you to guard the West Gate with vigilance. Deeply flawed ashlars don't make for good masons. Admitting men of bad character into our ranks hurts us deeply. I think this also teaches us a valuable lesson about how we look at evaluating the actions, the behavior of our brothers. If we ignore a problem, it doesn't just go away. We have to remind the brother in the friendliest manner possible of his fault. We got to aid in his reformation and defend his character. We got to call them on it every time in the right way, but every time. That's how we learn and how we grow. Finally, we need to be mindful of those truly Masonic virtues and circumspection. Observe, verify, keep your counsel. When it's time to act, act with prudence. Remember your obligations, the great tenets and cardinal virtues you were taught inside the lodge, and apply them without. Now, before I cease the presentation, I got to point out some really weird stuff that I learned in doing the research. First of all, Leroy is also the home of Jello brand gelatin. That's where the Jello Brick Road is located, and there is in fact a Jello museum if you ever happen to be retracing the steps of Morgan through Leroy. Now, what happened to Lucy Morgan? Well, she marries a former Mason after Morgan's disappearance. They spelled silversmith by the name of George Harris in 1830. Remember, Mormonism is also coming up at the same time. They're baptized into the Mormon Church in 1834. They moved to Missouri, where for a time Joseph Smith comes to live with the couple. And Lucinda, there's some controversy. She may have been sealed to Joseph Smith in 1838, maybe as a plural wife. And William Morgan is one of the very first people to be posthumously baptized into the Morgan faith in 1841. All right. With that, there are some references for what I was able to find out, and I will turn it back over to Most Worship Brother Jim. Questions, concerns, how do you do? Scotch.
First of all, yes, please. Nice the applause. Wow, this is that's a lot to digest there. My goodness. Let's see. Let's open it up for questions because there's a lot there. A whole heck of a lot there. David Colbeth.
It never. Well, first of all, an amazing presentation. I never had any doubts and never had any. I'm always impressed by Jeremy's presentations. Very worshipful Jeremy, and thank you very much for that and your continued support of training and teaching in our jurisdiction. Amazing, really well done and put together and planned and just awesome. I don't even know. There's not enough words to describe how well you do presentations. I'm always fascinated. If you've never had a chance to see his lectures, especially his first degree lecture, wow, it's a treat. It's a treat. It reminds me of how wild the Wild West was of Masonry, and not only the country, but of Masonry as well. It's a sordid history of Masonry. It's not just all love, brotherly love and friendship necessarily. There's some kind of craziness going on there.
Nick Franz, did you have your hand up?
A little bit. So as a Mormon, it was interesting for me to see that in the 1820s, when Mormonism was beginning, that this is one of the time periods when this was occurring. And it actually kind of shocks me that Morgan would be the first person to be baptized after death. And the whole thing just kind of surprises me with this.
Mike Palcodine, did I see your hand go up earlier? Okay. Yeah, Jeremy, you had a lot of fun going into what could have been a real rabbit hole.
There are so many rabbit holes here. It was pretty incredible. One of the things that struck me as I was going through it was that William Morgan wasn't just an imposter, but he was someone who held his rod as a deacon correctly and knew the floor work, was commended for it. And if he could give the middle chamber lecture so well that people were willing to pay his room and they passed the hat for him, no one has ever done that for me after I delivered a lecture. So I have something to aspire to now, I guess.
You know, I'd like some of that action too, by the way, just so you all know.
But unfortunately, you know, he was never invited back to these lodges because he'd had a tendency to walk away with stuff.
Yikes.
It is interesting the reverence that Masonry had in the past, as you talk about that they would pay brothers to come, and it was a bit of a mill in degrees creation and or delivery. It was a business for many guys to deliver degrees, and so it's interesting how that changed and it became more benevolent.
There was a quote in one of the sources that I didn't include where Morgan was alleged to have said to a person that he knew was going to go get his entered apprentice degree, you know, you're a damned fool for paying $15 for that degree because I can get you that and a whole lot more for $1.
Do you know what were the degrees from England, from Europe and other countries as they came from Ireland and Scotland, and were they paid degrees as well? Do you have any? I mean, I know we're kind of off the track here a little bit, but does anybody know, or do you know, Jeremy?
I'm a narrow subject matter expert. I do not know.
Actually, David, if you take the esoterica of the Scottish Rite Master Craftsman program, there's an entire section devoted to another gentleman. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, who was able to pass himself off as a Mason, who did something very similar to what Morgan did, or what Morgan has to do. By the way, Jeremy, I'm going to throw another challenge at you while I'm looking at the room here. You had mentioned another name in your presentation, and if you're looking to go down another rabbit hole, I would love for you to provide a presentation on Leo Taxel.
Oh, absolutely.
Harold.
He was a heck of a guy. I went down that rabbit hole a little bit.
Any other questions from anybody here? Ryan, yes, please.
Unmute. Jeremy, I just wanted to say thank you for putting on this presentation. I've read about the Morgan affair in going through the Scottish Rite Master Craftsman program. I've heard about it in different podcasts. But your detail on all this really brought the whole thing to life, and just fascinating presentation. I want to thank you for taking the time to do this.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Let's see who. I want to see who's Rob Thompson. Yes. Then I'm gonna get Harold Hobbs. Rob.
Let me unmute there. So Jeremy, it was interesting. I was doing a little sidebar research that out of the anti-Masonic movement, Joseph Smith was a Mason and moved into the. I understand he had his visions. Was that? I don't know if it came up in your research, but was that a direct relation of the anti-Masonic movement? And maybe Nick, I heard you say that maybe you were a Mormon, and I didn't know if that was a direct relation of the anti-Masonic movement.
Joseph Smith was a teenager when he had his visions. So it would have been long before he could have been a Mason, because I'm presuming that you had to be at least 21 to become a Mason.
Harold, go ahead and unmute yourself. You got to unmute yourself, Harold. Let me see if I can unmute you.
Okay, there.
There you
I
go.
just want to pass on some information. If anybody's interested in reading Morgan's work, the Grand Lodge Library has a copy. Plus, we also have a copy of the trials that took place during that period. So if anybody's interested, and during this closure, if you want to go there, you can give me a call. And I'll go down to the library and open it up. And it's not something you can check out because the copies are rather fragile due to their age. But one of the things I plan to do is to maybe try to scan it so we can get a digital copy.
Absolutely.
Get hold of.
And Harold, if I could just add, there are some digital copies for some of the older Masonic works. I actually downloaded a few of them, and it was a great aid to me in my research. The other thing that's pretty cool is that you can go back and look at some of the newspapers at the time, the little 4 sheets that they had, and those are a wild kit. It was really neat to be able to go in and actually read the letter that Worst Brother Brown wrote in 10 days before this all kicked off, to be able to read in the scanned version of the paper that very long article that he wrote, that letter to the editor, encouraging Masons to just chill out and let this thing blow over, and it would have been fine.
Mm-hmm. Gerald Myers, see your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I've done some reading on this, and I'm from Western New York there, but other than talking about Morgan there, some of the results of this Morgan affair, it had a great impact on what Masons did to get back into the good graces of the people. Masonry got reoriented itself from a majority philosophical organization into a charitable and more community-oriented chapter as a result of this Morgan affair.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Let's see, just gonna see. Yes, Mike Palcodine.
Jeremy, great job. What I loved, and you rarely see it in these presentations, is you delved in and found both sides of the argument. You know, how good he was, how scoundrelly he was, and how when you research stuff, you have to find that middle, because one person's going to look at it one way and somebody's going to look at it another.
You know, Harold mentioned something about, Jeremy and I were talking about one of the books that's one of the that deals with great detail with the Morgan affair, written by Stephen Defoe. Jeremy, you said you actually looked up the current cost of that book.
Yeah, on Amazon. Let's see if I still have it up here. Yeah, I'll if I can, I'll share my screen real quick, and I'll show you. So for the low price of $919, you can get a used one, or you can get one in paperback for $864.56. I did not use that tome in the preparation for this particular presentation, but there you go.
And as you saw you saw Jeremy's source material, this presentation is being recorded, so when we get it up and running, you can pause, you can fast forward to the end, pause, and and if you want to take a look at some of those individual pieces, then by all means, please do so.
And let's say if Jeremy would be willing to email me or Facebook message me those links, I could add them to the video when posted.
Absolutely.
Actually, they're at the end of the video, so you're in good shape. So.
I don't know if I flashed through all of them. There are three pages of references, actually.
Okay.
So I'll make sure that we get those over to David.
It's fantastic.
One of the really neat things that I found when I was doing this was that there's some YouTube stuff from like finding where the lodge jewels for Batavia 433 went. That's in a YouTube video, and you can see the jewels. It's pretty cool, and I've got that cited.
So I want to make sure I get everybody to get as many people involved. I'm just going to randomly call on people. Barry Rutkowski, you have anything at all? Got to unmute. No, you're unmuted.
I had double muted in case I hit the wrong button. Hey, no, it was wonderful. As several of the fellows have said, when I first joined the lodge, that was one of the things I went down the rabbit holes on many of these characters and one volume after another, and it would reference somebody else. And so you're actually 2 or 3 places removed as you get into these different ones. And so it was a marvelous story, but it did not, what I had was not nearly as much of both sides of it. You had the path that went through with the one particular author or just a couple of them. So, I found the yin and the yang, just fascinating that you were able to dig out on that, Jeremy. So thank you. It was great.
See, want to make sure. Gary Key, I see you're here. Good to have you. It's okay.
How's that?
It's okay. Good. How do you do you have a question at all for Jeremy?
No, I just thought it was a great presentation. I was familiar with the Morgan affair for quite some time, not to the detail that Jeremy gave us, and I certainly appreciate that. I did read a source once upon a time where Lucinda Harrison, or Harris, I guess. She was indeed sealed, according to this source, to Joseph Smith, and referred to as wife number 2. But that's the only thing that you did not cover that I happened to run across one time. Again, for a great presentation, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, there was documentation of when Joseph Smith's body was brought before Lucinda, that she was greatly sorrowful, and nobody could quite understand why, not being necessarily privy to the fact that she'd been sealed.
Mm-hmm. So last two, first of all, Bill Miller, it's always good to see you at these events. Thank you again for your continued support of these. Don't we just love Jeremy?
Yeah. I have a comment. First of all, I appreciate the presentation. It's something we've heard about for years and years, and you know a little bit about it, and you've done a little study. But Jeremy put it into a narrative that made it very interesting. We could follow through. I have an announcement that doesn't relate to that at all. Just to remind those of you that Todd Johnstone is going in for some surgery tomorrow.
Oh.
He's going to have he's had stability problems, and they've decided that it's water on the brain. So he's going in to have it drained tomorrow. They do this with a spinal tap, I guess. And but even so, I mean, a lot of people have had it, and I've heard other people talk about having had it. But even so, keep him in your prayers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Right, worshipful sir, is there a 6 steps class tomorrow?
There is not. The plan is to start again, starting at the beginning of the month of September. It was recommended that maybe I get kind of on a schedule like the first, second, and third Tuesday and just kind of roll with it in that fashion. I wanted to give a couple weeks break just so people can decompress and the word can get out a little bit. I'll put something out probably next week to get people geared up for it again.
So just a couple of announcements. Wednesday, Frank S. Land will be holding a Zoom at 7 o'clock. If you go to the Frank S. Land Facebook page, you'll see the you'll see the meeting ID. We're fortunate enough that we have some teachers that are affiliated with the Frank S. Land Lodge, and they're going to share with us what it's like to teach in pandemic times. We have an elementary school teacher, the person of Corey Freewalt, a middle school teacher, the person of Helen Thompson, who happens to be married to somebody on the screen, and worship brother Derek Heyman, who teaches high school up in the Lake Stevens area. So we're looking forward to having them sharing with us. That'll be at 7 o'clock. Hope you can make that. And next Monday, I'm really excited about next Monday. Illustrious brother Brent Morris will be joining us to talk about the timeline and histories of the higher degrees. As Jeremy alluded to earlier in his presentation, there's more to Freemasonry than the three, and it's important that we continue to expand our studies, and hopefully through these Zoom meetings, even though we haven't been able to meet in person, through these Zoom meetings we've been able to increase our studies. So with that, again, Jeremy, last word's yours.
I just want to thank everybody for attending tonight. As most worshipful brother Jim said, there are additional avenues for light. You get to hang out with all kinds of really cool guys, like I've had the privilege of hanging out with tonight. So I appreciate you all being here. I'm really glad that the PowerPoint worked, because my computer just about bombed on me about, I don't know, an hour before the presentation. I was really nervous. So I'm really glad that everything worked out. And again, I'm greatly appreciative of the forum here tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Again, everyone, hope to see you Wednesday, if not Wednesday, next Monday. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you all for spending time with us tonight. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.